All right, welcome everyone. It's great to have you all here. Scott Taylor is going to be telling us about some camp and the process of getting this started.
Great, thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be giving a talk at a differential equations conference. I've never done that before. I am a knot theorist and geometric topologist by profession. If you're willing to have your video on, and that'd be great to see your faces, but I understand if you can't. And feel free to jump in with questions as they go along. This is going to be pretty informal. But I would love to tell you about, oops, on my arrow. Interesting. I thought this worked, but my arrow keys are beeping at me.
If you just click, does it advance or no?
I don't know. Here, I can do it like that. Not quite in full screen, but that'll work. So I'd like to tell you about Some Camp, which is a summer math camp that I've been involved with creating over the past few years. And the goal, the whole point of this is to help elementary school kids build a strong sense of numeracy using the arts and math games. So, and in some sense, this is a hyper-local project, but our hope is that actually to inspire other people to do similar things. So if you hear my talk and you are thinking about doing something similar where you live, I would love to talk with you. So I live in Waterville, Maine, which is in central Maine. You can see it there on the map. We're about 3 hours north of Boston. It's fairly rural. It's actually a former mill town. So the main industry in Waterville were paper mills and clothing mills. Dexter shoes were made here. But unfortunately, in the 90s, almost all the mills shut down. So this is, of course, common across the US. And it really kind of, it plunged the city into poverty. Now, I work at Colby College, which is a fairly well-off academic institution. And there are other academic institutions in Waterville. There's Thomas College, which has kind of a business focus. And then just to the north of us, there's a community college. So it's an area with a lot of educational resources, but the public schools have real challenges. And a lot of them arise from the poverty in the area. And I first encountered this when my oldest son, who's now a freshman in high school, transitioned from the Montessori school where he had been going to kindergarten into the public schools for first grade. And he was bored out of his mind with the math. He would actually sob in the morning about going to school because the math was so boring, because he had loved math at the Montessori school. And so that got me involved in helping Colby students volunteer in math classrooms and figuring out ways to help keep my son engaged with math, while at the same time doing something to help the severely overburdened teachers. But I always had the sense that there was more that could be done. And I was sitting in a school board meeting one day when a volunteer in the schools told me this idea she'd had for a summer math camp. And it would be, unlike most math camps, this would be a camp that was aimed at children that struggle in math and are behind grade level in math. And actually, that's about 70%, 80% of our public school kids are behind grade level in math. That's actually probably, those are pre-pandemic numbers, so I'm sure it's more now. So there's a really large population of students that could benefit from this. And her idea was to center the camp around the arts and using arts to help kids develop a sense of numeracy. And her motivation for this was came out of the studies she'd done on the effects of trauma on people's reasoning. And she had this thesis, which I think is borne out by some evidence, that trauma can really affect people's ability to think logically and to do mathematics. And that the arts are a proven method of helping people of all ages manage trauma. And so her hope was that by using arts to teach math or to develop math skills, that she could help kids bypass some of the effects of trauma. And this dovetailed with some of the reading that I had been doing. I'd been reading some of Joe Bowler's work. She's a math education professor at Stanford, and she really advocates this idea that number sense is the most important foundation that students can have, because if kids understand and have a deep sense for how numbers work, the rest of math, like algebra, actually makes sense to them. And then they can genuinely learn it rather than have it be a set of rules that seem to come from nowhere. And with my background in geometric topology, I'd been heavily influenced by an article of Bill Thurston's, which was aimed at research mathematicians, called On Proof and Progress in Mathematics. And if you haven't read it, I encourage you to do it. It's, I think, a really provocative article. And one of the things he talks about in that article is how humans have many different ways of learning mathematics. And, coming out of geometric topology, he has a certain emphasis on the spatial and the visual and the kinesthetic. And in this article, he talks about how we operate at different, we can think of mathematical objects on different scales, whether there's something we hold in our hands or whether we're living in a geometric space. And that got me thinking about my own kids' experience and, why was it that they were so strong in math? And some of it is certainly that they live in a house where we talk about math a lot. And we've talked about math their whole lives. But we also do things like play board games together as a family. And if you think about board games, like many board games for kids have scoring tracks. Well, that's a number line. They've been moving things back and forth on number lines their whole lives, and they're rolling dice and getting a sense for probabilistic reasoning and strategy, and all these things that actually go into mathematics. My kids had been doing from a very young age, and many of the kids in Waterville, unfortunately, don't have those opportunities. So that really sparked the vision for the camp. The volunteer who suggested the idea had no way of obtaining funding to run the camp. And it turned out then that she was moving out of the area. And so it was something that I took up using Colby's resources. I was able to get some funding, and I'll tell you more about that down the road. And we were able to run the camp in 2019. And so this was a month-long day camp for Waterville public school children. And we explicitly tried to recruit kids who teachers identified as being particularly likely to benefit from it. So our funding was just for 1 year, and the pandemic also hit. And so between the pandemic and funding challenges, we didn't run it the past 2 years, but we now have funding to run it for the next 3 years, which I'm really thrilled about. And so we're in the process of getting that off the ground. So as I mentioned, the vision is really to use the arts and games to help kids encounter math and really internalize math with things they care about. And what do kids care about? They care about whether their art project looks good. They care about competition. They care about winning games. They care about making sense of the world they live in. They actually don't, so these are rising 4th and 5th graders the camp is aimed at. They actually don't really care about jobs. That's too far in the future for them. But they care about having fun. And so you can see in the lower left picture here, they're using a compass, and we taught them a little bit about angles and helped them figure out how to use a directional compass to tell directions. On the top right, they made big tangrams and had to, you can buy commercial tangrams that are quite small, but we had them make them really big, which was fun for them. One of the things that tied the whole camp together, as you can see in the lower right here, were camp journals. So these were journals where kids could record their thoughts and experiences from the camp, but they also kept track of camp points. And they would earn camp points by participating in games, by winning games. They would, if they had a good math conversation with one of the staff members of the camp, they would earn camp points. And anytime they earned camp points, they could earn camp points for cleaning up after lunch and all that stuff too. Anytime they earned camp points, they would have to add it to the number they earned to their total, and they'd have to add it by hand. And so by the end of the camp, the kids were adding numbers well into the hundreds, which were the biggest numbers they'd ever worked with, and they loved it. They loved the sense of mastery over large numbers. At the end of the month, we had an auction, and the kids could use their camp points to buy items in the auction. And that taught them, so they had to do some subtraction as they did that. It taught them some, we actually had a guest speaker come in and talk about different styles of auction. And so they got to think about the different strategies that you'd use for different kinds of auction. And of course, it also taught them delayed gratification, because they had to wait to spend their points until the object they really wanted came up for auction. So every morning, as the kids arrived, they would have breakfast and then go into music class. And we had our music teacher was someone with a degree in music therapy, and who is a local music teacher. And she did just a really marvelous job of helping the kids transition into the camp, but then also incorporating mathematical ideas into the musical activities. And so, for instance, the kids learned solfege, which is the do re mi way of moving up and down a scale. And so they got used to singing in scales, and then they transitioned into skip counting. So as they'd move along through the scale, saying numbers, counting by twos or threes or even sevens sometimes, and they'd count forward and backwards. They learned rhythms, and rhythms were explicitly connected to elementary fractions. So the idea that, a half note is twice as large as a quarter note, this kind of thing. By the end of camp, the kids were writing their own tunes by putting rhythm and notes and pitch together. And one of the children was got so excited by all this, he actually wrote an entire song, which the kids sang at the final performance. After a short break, then the kids would move to math games, and our math games were designed by Tom Klepak, who's the guy with the beard and his arm raised in the photo on the left. He's a biology PhD, but he has a deep love for games and camps and math. And so a lot of the games, the kids wore jerseys with numbers on them. And they played games like playground games that had been adapted to be mathematically themed. So there were versions of tag when kids would tag each other, they'd have to add the numbers on their jerseys, for instance, or subtract the numbers on their jerseys. As the kids were working these math problems, as they played the games, we would stop and have mathematical conversations with them. So there's this idea in math education called a number talk, which is a way to get kids talking about elementary mathematics in ways that really open them up to the idea that there's more than one way to solve an arithmetic problem. So it's heavily connected to mental math, for instance. So when the kids would encounter a math problem, they would stop and talk it through with us. As you can see on the upper right there. Some of the games involved number lines. So this was a favorite. It was a totally crazy game with the name of Super Mega Quaquaw Ball. And it involved, it was sort of a version of kickball where there were two teams, and the batting team would throw objects onto the field or kick objects onto the field. You can see the kid on the lower right there throwing a dodecahedral die onto the field. And every object was assigned 2 fielders. When it landed on the field, the 2 fielders would run to the object and then run out to the baselines, which were number lines. So we built the number lines out of taking the cow tags that ranchers use to clip onto cow ears, and we attached them to ropes. And so the kids would run and read off the position on the number line, and then go report that to kids sitting on the sidelines who were called statisticians, who would record it. And we actually then imported all those numbers we put all those numbers into Excel and made some scatter plots. And then we got to talk about different ways of representing these abstract ideas. And the kids, for instance, were able to look at the scatter plots of the data and say, oh, well, the football tended to end up in this part of the field because most of us are right-handed. So they were making these connections between abstract representations of numerical ideas and the physical representations. The kids also made the dice. You can see them playing wizard die up there, which was basically a version of craps. And then there were various tug of war games that involved where the rope was a number line and kind of moved back and forth. There were versions of sharks and minnows or night watchmen that were all mathematically themed and would result in really great mathematical conversations with the kids. After math games, they'd go to lunch and have a bit of a recess and then go to art. And a lot of the art activities were mathematically themed. One of my favorites was this one where they tie-dyed t-shirts, but before they tie-dyed their camp t-shirt, they had to make predictions about how red the t-shirt would end up being, like what proportion of the t-shirt would be red or blue or whatever. And then after their t-shirts were done, they got to see if their predictions for what their design would look like and what the color proportions would look like came out to be accurate. And you can see that the kid in the center there has a grid overlaid on a, so he drew what his t-shirt looked like, and then he overlaid a grid on top of it and was counting like what proportion of it was blue or yellow. And then there were lots of art activities where they got to mix things. So they made slime and from a recipe, and they got to use fractions, of course, for that. Different groups had different versions of the recipe, so they got to compare how the different proportions affected the outcome. So in the afternoon, we actually split the kids in two. So half of them would go to art and half to theater, and then they'd switch. The theater games were less mathematically themed and more themed around ideas of growth mindset. So when we interviewed the kids before camp, they actually all loved math, and they like loved division, and they loved how numbers were starting to make sense of their world. But when you would ask them a question like, how do you feel when you get a math problem wrong? They would burst into tears. And you could tell that they were just so close to giving up and checking out of math. So our hope was that this intervention would help prevent that from happening. And so theater, a lot of the theater games surrounded teamwork and collaboration and growth mindset. Some of them involved, like, we use goniometers, which are what devices physical therapists use to measure joint angles. So they would use goniometers in like theater sports to measure the different angles that their bodies would make, things like that. They also wrote with the theater teacher, put together a story that they acted out at the final performance. And it involved two different math kingdoms, one of which only knew how to add and multiply, and the other one only knew how to subtract and divide. And they had to get together in order to successfully solve a math problem. And the kids, of course, loved dressing up. So where did the funding for the camp come from? Well, it turns out that in Maine, and I suspect in many other places, there are a lot of foundations that are actually devoted to helping regional organizations confront various kinds of problems, including educational ones. And so our initial grant came from the Davis Educational Foundation, or actually the Davis Family Foundation. I think I grabbed the wrong logo there for the slide, but and it was a one-time grant that was intended to kind of help kick the whole thing off. And we were able to buy a lot of supplies that we can reuse, and I was committed to paying our teachers well. So the camp, the first year we ran it, cost about $60,000 and for the summer. And with hindsight, we should have had more money, but we made it work. So for the next 3 years, where does our funding come from? Well, I was fortunate enough to get an NSF research grant through their RUI program for research at undergraduate institutions. And the camp actually played a really big role in my ability to get the grant, in order to get the grant. We also got, I managed to scrape together a lot of funding from Colby itself. So Colby has an Institute for Human Rights, and education is, of course, a human right. So they have contributed money. The Center for Arts and Humanities is there to support the arts and humanities. And so we were able to get funding from them. And then in order to make up the difference, I actually went to Colby's president and said, hey, can you help us out? And Colby's president has a an interest in helping improve public education in Waterville, because the long-term success of Colby and its ability to attract faculty actually means we have to have a strong public school system. And so he was enthusiastic to put in the rest of the money. And then I would be remiss if I didn't mention the Waterville Public Schools as really important partners in all this. As we created the camp and as we've recruited kids, we've worked really closely with the math specialist at the public schools, who's been really supportive and I think has felt very supported by us as well. Waterville is a Title I school, and they're able to use their Title I funds. So these are funds from the federal government to help communities with high poverty levels. So they use their Title I funds to provide busing and breakfast and lunch for the schools. And they also give us space, which is really great. So we actually run the camp out of the 4th and 5th elementary school, grade elementary school. So I'll just conclude here by saying a little bit about what the response to the camp was. So the kids loved it. And this is pretty amazing because a lot of these children really were kind of checked out of school math. They liked the idea, but they didn't like doing any of the work. But they were doing math every day for 4 weeks, and they loved it. Many of them actually cried when the camp was over. Their parents talked about how much they loved it. One girl told us that she was so inspired by the camp, she actually got her multiplication flashcards out of her closet and was going through them on her own. And parents told us too that the camp actually transformed their perspective on mathematics. So every week I would write a letter to the parents. And of course, I have no control over how much of it they read. But I talked with some of the parents and they really appreciated it. And I gave them, in the letter, I would give them strategies for talking about math with their kids. You know, those of you who maybe have experience with parents with kids and going through the Common Core system, a lot of parents find it very baffling and are kind of frustrated that they can't help their kids. And one of the things I tell them is that the goal is that when your kids have kids who are encountering some new math system, that they're actually equipped to be able to adapt and sit down and figure stuff out with their kids. And I think for a lot of parents, these were new ideas for them, that math is about figuring stuff out. Just a couple of lessons we learned. So, you know, a lot of the children in our community have experienced real trauma. And so it was important that our staff go through mandated reporter training before working with kids. And we were also inspired by this classic book, The Body Keeps the Score, which is about how trauma actually physically affects people's brains and their bodies. And that helps equip staff in order to deal with outbursts and behavioral issues. And I think that's really important because otherwise it's just so easy to exacerbate problems rather than help move beyond them. So obviously these photos were taken pre-pandemic, but we had about 100 family members and friends show up to the final performance. There were 20 kids at the camp. I was expecting maybe 20, 25 adults to show up, but we had about 100. And school board members came, the principals came, and entire families came to support their kids at this final performance. And they were just so enthusiastic about it. The teachers also had a great time. It was just a lot of fun. So I will stop there and I'm happy to take questions.
Any questions for Scott? You can unmute yourself and ask, or type in the chat and we can read them too.
So I can tell you one of the other things we learned was that not all kids like to run around. There are kids that just want to sit. And so we sort of on the fly had to adapt a lot of the games to incorporate elements which allowed kids to just sit. We also, Tom and I have kids that are the same age, and a lot of Tom's original plans for games turned out to be way too complicated because they were designed with our kids in mind, and our kids had grown up learning how to play games. And so again, we had to simplify a lot of the games on the fly in order to be able to teach them to the kids. And we brought the kids into this too. So we gave the kids the chance to adapt game rules and things like that as we went along.
Very cool. How many staff did you have? You mentioned Tom helped with a lot of the design of what was going on. You, I'm sure, did a huge amount of the design. How many people were like?
Yeah, great question. So we had, so I ended up spending way more time on this. So as we're running this again, I've actually been able to hire a camp director.
Cool.
For the going. I in 2019 I was heading into sabbatical, so that I could spend a lot of time on it. But we now have a camp director who's taking on a lot of what I did. So going into this next year, we have the camp director, and then we have 4 teachers, and the teachers are really just at the camp a half day each, kind of for their slot, and then a little bit beyond to help with other aspects. So that we have a math teacher, who is Tom, music teacher, theater teacher, and art teacher. And then each of them had an assistant. And then I think we had 2 other kind of floating assistants.
Okay.
For the camp.
And amongst the assistants, were they all people with math backgrounds, or you had a variety?
No, actually, none of them were really people with math backgrounds. So we had one Colby student who was an education major. We had a woman who was had just graduated from high school and was heading to Bowdoin, one of our rivals. And we had a couple students who were doing in the process of doing master's degrees, either in music or in education. And they were doing master's degrees in the University of Maine system. So Colby doesn't have master's students.
Oh, what a cool interdisciplinary team.
Yeah, it was really fun. And one of the things we need to do for this next year is actually provide more training on them for them with regard to how to conduct number talks and how to talk about math with kids. Because it turns out that when a lot of our staff, when they had very good intentions, but when they were suddenly confronted with a student that was struggling with a math problem, they tended to resort to kind of algorithmic ways of solving it rather than helping the kid talk through it. So we've built for this summer, we've built in 3 days of training to help practice some of that in advance.
Nice. Yeah. We also had a question coming to the chat from Carl. How many hours per day were the kids at the camp? And it was 4th grade that you said, correct? 4th and 5th grade? Yes,
4th and 5th grade. So rising 4th and 5th graders. So they were there from 8:30 to 2:30. Okay. Well, which really meant like 8 to 2:30 or 3. It was a challenge negotiating daycare kinds of things. So the public schools actually have something they call adventure camp, and a lot of the parents wanted the kids to go on field trips with the adventure camp, which would mean they'd miss a lot of days of camp, which was kind of a problem. So we're going to be stricter about attendance for the coming summer.
Yeah. Very cool. It is 6:30, which means that if you're going to a second talk in this session in a different room, you might need to run off. Otherwise, any other final questions? Yeah, thank you from Nathan in the chat. Thanks from all of us. This is very interesting. What a cool endeavor, and so awesome that you have the 3 years of funding secured to really build the program.
Yeah, if you're interested in reading more about the camp, I actually just had a blog posted on the AMS Teaching and Learning blog.
Oh, nice.
If you do a Google search, I'm sure it'll come up, and there's a bit more detail in there.
Awesome. Cool.
Thanks so much. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. All right. Have a good night, everyone.